I would like to welcome all of you immediately here at this wonderful meeting. It's the public part of our winter school with the name of Taming the iMonster, Regulating Digital Platforms. And it is hosted on our research platform, Governance of Digital Practices at the University of Vienna, which brings together researchers from the social sciences, law, and operations research to study questions such as the one today, which should bring together topics, but also expertise from science, policy, and practice, but also including activism. So before we get straight to the content, I have a few organizational remarks. And before I also will introduce everybody, which you'll see on the spotlight here, which is appearing at the moment. So those organizational points are, first of all, the session is recorded and then afterwards published on the web. Yeah. So if you do not wish to appear in this recording, please do not turn on your mic, your camera, and do not use the chat function. We have time until 6 p.m. So the idea is to have a lot of content and not so much introduction. And this content will be organized in 2 rounds of a panel discussion before we open the floor to your questions. During the discussion, please keep your mics muted and post your comments and questions to the chat. We will monitor them and get back to you in the last quarter of the roundtable. And now let me very briefly introduce you to the topic of today and the speakers. It's a rather gloomy and sad day today. Another open war, a hybrid war, so near to all of us, and one that is being waged on many fronts and has been waged for some time already. For example, also on social media and through a variety of propaganda strategies. I can still remember, and I think Jürgen, you will remember our conversations about it as well, in 2014, when people started investigating social bot networks and their multiplication of political propaganda in Ukraine, and the difficulty not only to define what actually constitutes such a bot, is it a human or is it a machine? But also to get access to the necessary data to investigate the phenomenon scientifically in an adequate way. So today I got a message on Twitter that parents are warned, for example, that they should better control their children's TikTok channels because the propaganda of that war would not stop there either. So the actors of those propaganda and psychic warfare operations may have definitely changed since 2014. The Ukraine war being just one among many other areas of conflict and political propaganda and conspiracies that we are facing today. Think about all the context of the COVID pandemic. However, the problems from back then remains, as scientific or legal access to social media data is still extremely limited, or it's being limited as we speak. So with knowing how many people around the world use social media every day, it's knowing that it still remains so opaque about knowledge, what algorithms control communication and information, which data is shared, which data is shown to us on basis of which decisions, it's becoming more and more important to start investigating those circumstances. And many people have done that in the last years, but only recently, several research projects that had been very successful had to be discontinued. For example, Facebook suspended the accounts of NYU researchers conducting independent public research, but they also forced AlgorithmWatch of where John Albert is actually working and is part of our panel today. They forced AlgorithmWatch to terminate their Instagram monitoring project. And I think they were really threatening your NGO with legal action. I think you will tell us more about it later. So public interest research, that's what it's called in many contexts. That is research that is done on issues of public interest, of course. But the idea here is that the beneficiaries are often unable to carry out the research on their own behalf. For example, when they need to find evidence for litigation or government or corporate misconduct. And sometimes in this setting of public interest research, information and technologies resulting from the research are made freely available. And especially in questions of the digital transformation, one of which is also the responsibilities of social media in providing and multiplying dangerous content, for example, but also, for example, of the many open governance issues of artificial intelligence. This sort of research is urgently necessary to create and implement clear legislation that requires and enables first and foremost transparency of the services, but also discusses the responsibilities and rights of the providers and users. And for this reason, we have gathered today here a wonderful group of people that all come from very different backgrounds, but do in a way or two similar things in this broad idea of public interest research. And so I would briefly go through you guys and just super briefly introduce you. So we have first and foremost, because his name starts with A, John Albert, who is a policy and advocacy manager at AlgorithmWatch, covering platform regulation and automated decision-making in the workplace. Then we have Wolfie Christl, a technologist, researcher, writer, educator, and digital rights activist based here in Vienna. Hi there. Then we have Jonathan Gray, who is Associate Professor in Critical Infrastructure Studies at King's College London. And among many, many other things, you're also the co-founder of Public Data Lab. Jürgen Pfeffer, hi. You are Professor of Computational Social Science and Big Data at the Technical University of Munich and also Adjunct Professor at Carnegie Mellon University. And then there is Theresa Züger, who is head of the Public Interest AI Research Group and co-leader of the AI and Society Lab at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. And then there is Meropi, my colleague Meropi. Maybe you also want to say hi because you're the co-moderator today.
Thanks, Katja. Yeah, thanks, Katja.
And you're currently at the University of Innsbruck.
Yes, I've just moved to the University of Innsbruck, where I work as a senior researcher at the Department for Applied Sociology of Law and Criminology. Happy to be here together with you.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have you all. So let's jump directly into the topic. And I would like to start the first round saying that it's so important to have public interest research. But before we talk about the priorities or the bigger questions, the more abstract questions that may arise from that, it would actually be great to hear a word or two from you guys, where you come from, what you do, and what basically are the problem situations that you are confronted with and that brought you to do this kind of research. And I would like to start immediately with John, because I already mentioned AlgorithmWatch and the problems you are currently or you have been facing with Facebook. And maybe you want to give us a brief account on what happened and what your plans are now.
Sure. Thank you so much, Katja and Meropi, for organizing this and for inviting me to speak. So my name is John. I work for AlgorithmWatch. I'm on the policy and advocacy team. I've been there since November. So talking about these projects, I'm here, as a representative of the organization. I wasn't actually working on these as they were live, but I was following them as it was happening because I was, had my eye on the work that AlgorithmWatch was doing. So first, I'll say we're a nonprofit organization. Our focus is looking at automated decision-making systems in Europe and trying to shed light on these systems. And so for us, looking at or investigating the Instagram newsfeed algorithm is totally in line with our core mission as an organization. Instagram is obviously a hugely influential platform. I think 1 in 3 Europeans has an Instagram account. So to go to this problem situation, Katja, that you alluded to, I'll just talk about briefly what our project was. It was a data donation, I say was, so stay tuned. It was a data donation project in which we had participants install an extension on their web browser on their computers. And this allowed us to essentially see their Instagram feeds. And in particular, we were interested in a handful of accounts that had everybody follow who participated in this. And we were pursuing a couple of different research interests. So one of our interests was influencer accounts on Instagram. So essentially content creators who have a large following, and they're posting about fashion, beauty, food, travel, and these kinds of things. And our findings from that project were very interesting and troubling. We found essentially that content creators, when they posted images on Facebook or on Instagram, excuse me, that posts that showed more skin. So for men, and being shirtless in the posts, or women in bikinis, for example, these posts showed up significantly higher in the news feeds of the participants that were participating in this project. And this implied that the algorithm, for whatever reason, was pushing or nudging its users to show more skin in their posts, because these posts performed better on the platform. Another research interest we had to do was in the lead up to the elections in Germany and in the Netherlands. And we essentially found, one of the findings from that was that the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right political party in Germany, their posts tend to perform better on average, or show up higher on average in users' feeds than posts from other political parties in Germany in the run-up to that election. So just as an aside, this project that we did this is not a comprehensive audit by any means. I mean, we were limited by our methodology with this data donation, also because all of our participants, their data was completely anonymized, so we had no idea about their ages or gender or location or anything. So it's quite possible our samples were biased in some way that we were not aware of, but nevertheless, these findings were significant and were reported widely. So we reached out to Facebook for comment. Before we published our findings, they didn't respond. After we published, they wrote us saying that our methodology was significantly flawed in certain ways, but didn't explain how it was flawed. And then a year later, essentially, we were told to cease and desist unless we wanted to go to more formal engagement, which we took to mean a threat of legal action. And because AlgorithmWatch were a small organization, we could not handle the risk of going to court with a company as rich and powerful as Facebook, so we had to terminate our project. So yeah, that's I'm aware we were trying to keep these introductions short. I don't know how much more you want me to say, but just coming to sort of fast forwarding to me now coming on board with AlgorithmWatch, it seems clear from our experience, also the NYU Ad Observatory, that unless we have institutions and laws that are going to protect independent research, public interest research into how tech platforms work, essentially organizations like ours are going to be under constant threat of being sued, because platforms can always say that we're violating their terms of service, which they can update according to their whims. Yeah, and I will hand it over to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I think we'll come back to what the next steps would be also for an organization like AlgorithmWatch. But I would like now to move to you, Wolfie, because you have had in the last time quite a lot of experience with bigger institutions that you cooperated with to do your research. And maybe you will, and just recently you published a big study on the tracking in the online gambling industry, and maybe you want to tell us a little bit how those things came about and how your cooperation also with these kinds of institutions were happening.
Yeah, so hello everybody. Wolf Chrisley is my name, and yeah, in recent years. So I'm working with a tiny, not a small, but a tiny nonprofit organization in Vienna called Cracked Labs, but I'm collaborating with many other organizations and institutions all the time. And in recent years, I contributed my research to civil society organizations, consumer protection organizations, trade unions, but also law firms and even data protection authorities in Europe. I'm focusing on the commercial data industry and on how companies use personal data on and against consumers, and very recently also at the workplace. Yeah, I'm not an academic. Some academics think my work is too activist. Some advocates think my work is too academic. So I'm somewhere in between, perhaps. And so I'm not just like investigating data flows, but based on my background in technology and sociology and some knowledge about business and law and economy and so on. But I also try to make knowledge accessible very often. So via a game I created in the past, like creating infographics, doing Twitter procrastination and so on. So my investigations, I did a little bit of work about Facebook ad targeting and political ad targeting as well. But my main work is about the data industry, about tracking on the web, on mobile apps, on data brokers and so on. So I'm trying to uncover how they really collect, use, exploit, analyze, exchange, and so on data. And I use different methods to do this. So the most important thing is like kind of open source intelligence, I would say. So I use lots of corporate sources, like including documentation, API documentation, and so on. I use lots of Google, lots of archive.org. I use tools like Whois requests or tracker databases that already exist from private companies, from Who Tracks Me to DuckDuckGo's Tracker Radar, to information that the industry discloses as a part of the pseudo compliance frameworks. For example, by the IAB, they also have some resources you can use to do this. And also like some cybersecurity databases that contain historical data on observations and data flows. So what I'm basically doing is, yeah, I'm working like an intelligence analyst at the CAA, but in the public interest. Sometimes I wish I would have software from Palantir for data mining and so on, but no. I do it by myself. And the second method I use is like technical testing. I'm trying to observe which data is being transmitted in the background when you visit websites and apps. And also I use subject access requests under the GDPR to get information from companies. And then I try to put everything together. And for example, then I uncovered how a UK gambling company and its many third-party partners collect and share personal data with each other, which may lead to legal action. We'll see. Yes, and finally, like I also did some work on systems on the workplace. Yeah, this also included like going through thousands of pages of some kind of software, from cybersecurity software to ERP systems and so on. But I also like, I'm watching videos, product training videos that are available on those products. Of course, this research is also very much based on my trainings I did with workers in the last 7-8 years. So I would say I also use some kind of ethnographic methods. And I even like am reading subreddits from people from the ed tech industry and so on. And I don't know, I think that's it for now. So I have some suggestions about what are the limits, what would be required, what would be needed, but I think we can discuss this later.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Wolfie. This is coming in the second round when we think about the bigger frameworks that we would like to have in place for the things we do. But you mentioned something that which is a beautiful bridge to the next person I would like to ask to speak, which is who is Jonathan, because you were talking about that you also train people, and I think this was always also a big aspect of your professional life, Jonathan, that you always thought about how to basically translate the research you did into activism and into the fields that you were studying. So maybe you want to tell us a bit more about, well, you can't tell us about everything that you did, but maybe give us a short glimpse.
Yeah, I also, I mean, on that last point, you know, there's so much interesting digital investigative work going on in journalism and in NGOs. So I think it's really important that we talk about kind of collective learning rather than just imagining knowledge transfer from universities to outside in the sort of traditional sense, or indeed the way we think about evidence. Maybe that's something we'll go on to talk about more later. But I think particularly in this area, taking a more situated approach to what counts as evidence is really important. But so my work explores the role of digital data, digital methods, and digital infrastructures in the composition of collective life. I have lots of different sorts of interests and projects. I'm a co-founder of the Public Data Lab, which is an interdisciplinary network exploring what difference the digital makes in attending to public problems, including developing materials and formats for collective inquiry, both with and about digital data, digital methods, and digital infrastructures. So my main research project at the moment is a book on data worlds and the politics and practices of public data, including how researchers, journalists, and activists are using data, modifying data, creating their own data, making improvised data infrastructures, and so on. That's forthcoming. And together with Liliana Bunagru, I recently co-edited the Data Journalism Handbook, which explores different kinds of data practices in data journalism, which was a collective experiment in accounting for these practices, including both researchers and journalists, investigators, and others, reporters, and included looking at what it means to articulate issues with data or to materialize issues with data, how different groups are assembling their own forms of data, including different styles for doing this, not just, as Wolfie was saying, you know, the sort of more conventional and expected academic styles of collecting data, but sometimes also based on things like screenshotting, improvised setups, and so on, which I think is very sort of interesting and sort of important to learn from. We also look at things like investigating data platforms, algorithms, including app ecosystems, web trackers, and so on. And drawing on work in science and technology studies, in the book, we try and look at data, not just in terms of representations, but in terms of relations. And we look at what this kind of relational sensibility can bring to how we think about collaborative inquiry as a kind of curatorial craft, assembling and working with different sorts of materials, communities, and infrastructures. At the end of the book, at the end of the introduction to the book, there's 12 challenges for critical data practice, and maybe we can kind of come back to some of these sorts of things, but they're prompts for thinking about how collective inquiry with digital data can be undertaken without taking the means through which it's produced for granted. And just as a final thing, to give you a sense of some of the work that we do with the Public Data Lab, this is often, again, grounded in humanities research, particularly science and technology studies and internet studies. But the aim is to support collaborations between researchers, journalists, students, activists, civil society groups, and others through what we call engaged research-led teaching. And often this takes a question or a problem from a civil society or journalistic collaborator as a starting point, but often the problem or the question is transformed through the research process, involving some quite significant modifications in how the problem is understood. So, for example, with fake news, shifting from looking at problematic content to look at the media infrastructures which enable the circulation of this content, including technical commercial underpinnings, tracker infrastructures, and so on. In another very different project we did recently, looking at the Amazon fires, there was a shift from looking at misleading imagery to looking at the role of generic images and stock photography more generally in mediating the politics of environmental events and natural disasters, and kind of thinking about other sorts of formats, often involving starting with the formats that we have, the vernacular formats in the field, and introducing little modifications or twists to tell different sorts of stories, as per Donna Haraway's well-known line: "It matters what matters. What matters what stories we tell stories with." So yeah, I'll stop there, but that's a little bit of a sense of what we do.
Yeah, so obviously these intersections or connections that you mentioned are super important. And as we can see, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book as well. So even data can be seen as a relation. So maybe we will also come back to that. But now I would like to ask Jürgen to be the next one, because teaching critical thinking on data is also what you do, I know, but also you have quite a lot of experience in looking at social media platforms really from the scientific methodological standpoint. So what methods do we actually need to look at them in a scientific way, and what can we get out of there? And maybe you want to tell us a bit more about your research in that direction, but of course mention everything that comes to your mind as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation. So let me start there. My driving force is I would like to understand to say a German sentence, was die Welt im Innersten zusammenhält. So what drives the world and binds it forth, or whatever the correct translation is. But so basically from a how do topics emerge? How do they diffuse in a society and these kind of things? I would like to understand how is a political agenda formed? How do these things work? And in order to, and right now I have yeah, Annika? Okay. And so when social media came up, it was clear for us that this is, of course, like in 2009, when they published this article about computational social science, forming this new field, saying, okay, now all these social science questions from communication science, political science, sociology, that people have been studying for decades, now we have the data on our fingertips, right? We don't need to interview people anymore. We have everything. We can download it. And to cite the famous big data book here, I don't want to say the author because it's not a good ending of this sentence, that has a chapter that is called N is all, and that starts with in a time of an abundance of data, we can abandon the old thinking of sampling and statistical problems of populations, because we now have everything. We don't need to think about these things. And then when we started to work with this data, it was clear pretty quickly that, well, if you are not interested in the system, but if you're interested in the people, it's hard and it's complicated. And so I have spent my last 10 years basically finding more layers of problems, why this connection, why this basic idea of we want to understand society, and society behaves online, and they create these shadows, these traces of their behavior, and we collect the traces and then we infer something about society, why it doesn't work at all in many cases. And it's not just about who is online. This is easy because we now know, okay, there's a population bias, we have bots and all these things. But because my actual university background is in computer science, we also try to look into the socio-technical aspects of basically what are the problems of the underlying software architecture, and what does it do? What does the system architecture do with our data, and how does it basically destroy the data from a social science perspective? So, but just the way they store the data, the way they allow us to access the data. So I have published basically starting from, it's of course mostly Twitter, because Twitter is happy to share data and has been doing it in a nice way, but as we have shown more and more, in a not so useful way often. And so they give you data, but they don't tell you what it is. And so we try to figure out what the problems are. And recently, our last paper, where Katja was also co-author, we have actually made them, even though they were they have refused for a year to discuss the results with us. They have changed the way they sample the data in order to fix the problem they have to show. And so while the interest basically starts on understanding society by using these kind of data, we convert it into from a hooray phase of social media analysis into a holy shit, nothing works phase. And I am still reaching for the third phase that it says, however, like still there is some useful signal in it, and this is basically the we're working on right now, or how to even change the platforms or the way we ask research questions in order to make the data useful for us. And so starting from computational social science, I found myself more and more under the headline of critical data and algorithm studies, because that's the actual problem, the first problem that we have to deal with. And on a side note, I also have because I have been in the US for a couple of years, and I have spent way too much time with people from the defense and security and something background. I have developed an organizational fetish. So I have spent the last 5 years also accepting every crazy invitation that I have gotten. So I have been to the Palantir headquarters. I have been to a diverse set of army bases. I have been to talked with NSA and CIA people because I want to understand these people as well. So this is just a side effect. And from this, I want to close now saying, which brings me to the same point than the social media institutions. And this is also like citing Katja now from our first conversations, I don't know, 15 years ago. And she said to me, and I remember she said, don't overestimate these companies, because at the end of the day, Twitter is just a tool implemented by a bunch of freaks or nerds. And this is what we have shown again and again. They also make mistakes. So basically, I think by forcing them to and researching on them, we could also make their platforms better, because they make mistakes. They make funny things, and also, as I would say now, also do not overestimate any one of those institutions. These people click on buttons in tools and they calculate something, and the difference is whether they try to calculate whom they want to bomb with a drone, or who they want to interview next for the social science studies in an undergrad or kindergarten. The knowledge is about the same level, and the methods are the same, and the tools are often the same. And this is also the scary thing from my perspective, that most of the people in the world that are dealing with serious or unserious questions have about the same knowledge as we have here in this room. And this also brings me back to this AlgorithmWatch and these kind of things, and how important these things are to press these organizations constantly, because they don't think about the problems actually that they create by themselves often. So most of them, sure, there are some evil people, but I would say most of them are not evil. They're just not the smartest. Or as I said, some of them are smart and evil. That's okay. These are the bad guys. But I think there's a lot of uninformed people in the world that where maybe there is a chance of changing something in terms of
being. We need to be loud. We need to be heard. This is the idea of public interest research in that sense. Yeah. Thanks, Jürgen. So time is running again, so we have to jump already to the next speaker, which is Theresa. And you're basically concluding this first round of introduction / problem space opening. And I think Jürgen bridged very well several topics that you also are dealing with, especially working in the field of artificial intelligence and the many open questions that are there, especially now in Europe. But also looking to China with very different approaches in how legislation is dealing with the rights and responsibilities in this area. So maybe you want to give us a glimpse into your work.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for putting together this really interesting group of people. Yes, I'm leading the AI in Society Lab and the Public Interest AI Research Group at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. And this whole concept of public interest is actually something new to the discussion around AI. More often we hear about AI ethics, and about AI for social good, which is a terribly broad term. And in the worst case, it's just a marketing term. In the best case, people at least think about ethics when they talk about that. But it's terribly broad and underdefined. And that is one goal of our research group, to actually say what we mean by public interest AI. So I'm a political theorist, media studies scholar, so I'm interested in understanding that concept and spelling it out in processes and methods for developing and implementing AI. And what we do in our group is very interdisciplinary. We're like 3 PhDs and a postdoc, and we're actually also developing prototypes that try to achieve some AI in the public interest as we understand them. So we're kind of trying to fulfill the normative goals that we have in our own projects. And I will not say so much about projects. If there's somebody interested in that, maybe we can come back to some of them later. We're doing something about language simplification in German. So translating in simple German language is one thing. Then we are developing design patterns for public interest AI for others to reuse and help them develop public interest AI themselves. We're creating an assistive tool for fact-checking, which is focusing on claim detection with natural language processing. And we also have a project that focuses with the help of open data about the accessibility of places to actually use machine learning to say more about the likeliness of a place to be accessible or not. So it's for wheelchair users mainly a tool that we try to provide. And so there is a lot of interest in our research, and I think there in Germany specifically, there's starting to be a discourse around public interest AI, but in the broad picture, what we do is super niche. So the broader AI industry really doesn't care so much about this very strict approach, because for us, it's very important to say that we understand the public interest to be the opposite of private interests or group interests. So anything which has mainly profit maximization at its heart is for us not in the public interest, and also for many political theorists. So that is one big division. So that's why we have this very specific cut to projects that we're interested in, and we believe much more of those need to exist in the field of AI, because right now we're just experiencing that big industries are driving what AI is used for, and it's not really societies deciding what it's used for. And one thing that is super interesting for us, besides what I said, this working on the concept and understanding it better for AI, is that regarding platforms, there is this interesting issue that users are actually super unaware how AI is used on platforms like, for instance, Facebook. And Facebook kind of claims that there is something like explainability of AI, but if you take a closer look, it's more than of a facade of something like explainability. And you get an explanation, something like, you're shown this ad because you're a woman between 20 and 50. And that is one of the reasons. How important it is and what the other reasons are that you're showing this ad is just left out of the picture. So people are kind of given some kind of fake transparency in a way. And I think that is also something that kind of relates me to other researchers in this group, that we're also interested in understanding what explainability for AI could look like, to have an actual transparency about how AI works, and how people are affected by the most powerful AI systems that what a lot of people use every day, at least. Yeah, maybe that's enough from me for now.
Thanks a lot, Theresa. I'm gonna take over and start our second round. The main topic of our second round is, where should priorities for public interest research be in the future? What are the challenges? What are strategies? Which strategies are needed? Which approaches should be taken? Which methods should be used? Which legal frameworks are necessary? Or what kind of organizations, institutions should be involved, and maybe also collaborate together? And maybe Theresa, if that is okay, I would like to start with you. Maybe you would like to elaborate that a little bit more on the topic of explainable AI.
Sure, also that, but I also have some other ideas listed that I think are super relevant. So maybe I'll just start with some things that are really burning topics for me. One thing that we believe also coming from a theoretical basis of understanding public interest is methods that are very much based on participation. And that is something that I think applies for a lot of people doing research right here. They're using that already, but especially for developing AI in our fields and for implementing it in fields where the public is affected in many ways, there is way too little types of participation that are playing any role. And very often, if there is some kind of participation, it's more like a symboling of, yeah, we asked some people and they said something and that happened, but it's not like a real democratic say that people get in how technology is produced and how technology is implemented. So I think that would be something that needs much research and also much more realization and practice, how participation can be part of the methods. And then for us, it's a super important goal to actually develop something like standards in the processes of building technologies that are for the public interest, and something that people can agree on, even though technologies might be very different. But we believe that those processes are super important. Yeah, and this field of explainability of AI generally has the huge downsides up to this stage that explainability is pretty much thought of for developers and maybe expert users. So a very technical crowd or somebody who's has a domain expertise. But explainability right now is not really thought of to be something for citizens. So we believe that actually there could be a new role for whom explainability is actually tailored to, and that is the advocate for civil society, because many details about AI systems are not for everybody maybe to understand, and maybe not everybody needs to get into every technical detail there is, but advocates for civil society like AlgorithmWatch or others need to be able to voice concerns for citizens, and also special interest groups of minorities or vulnerable groups need to be able to. And that is a big problem, that right now explainability really stops with the domain expert. So there needs to be much more transparency on the data that is used, on how it's trained, on the limits of the data used, on the biases that are inevitable in many ways. So yeah, I think that is very, very necessary to actually create something like explainability for the public. And I have more points, but I will just stop here so we can hear more from the others also.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Theresa. I'd like to move on to Jürgen and ask you what kind of sandboxes do you think are needed? Because I think it links nicely to what Theresa just mentioned.
Yeah, I would just like to add on what Theresa just said, because it seems like, I don't know, it seems like responsible and explainability AI is like, I don't know, it's like the new, what was the stuff called in the 0 years that the big industries did, where it was about the public interests? There was this term, I forgot about it, maybe somebody can post it. There was this big corporate social responsibility, correct? Yeah, so I think that's the new corporate social responsibility, and so I think it has two. I think we should split this up in a one way, like what you just said. We need to find ways to communicate actually to regular people and to also show them the implications of their doing. But on the other side, I think we need something like, I mean, let's call it a. I mean, I know this is not the best institution in the world, but in the last 2 years, it worked quite well. Let's call it like a Robert Koch Institute for Data and Algorithms. Like in the sense of, is there a, like, when you remember back, like, I don't know, almost 2 years now, in Austria, what did the mobile companies do when they wanted to help the government in order to track, like, how people move? They took the data and sent it to the government, and of course then people said, are you guys crazy? How can you just send this to the government for analysis? In Germany, they sent it kind of to an institution that had like some form of respect or credibility. So, and it worked much better with all the things that didn't work in the last few years. But so I think maybe we need something that is somewhere between AlgorithmWatch and all these other private things. Maybe we need something like a layer where there is an organization that maybe where universities and NGOs send people, and this institution has by law elevated access. So because I would like to have Wolfie Christl access to Facebook data. I don't think that everybody needs to have access to Facebook data and algorithm, but I think some people should have in order to have more control over these things. And so maybe something like this, because this could be a useful way of forcing the society onto these institutions to say, okay, we need some, and that's why the word also Meropi used the word sandboxing. Like, can we create an environment where these institutions actually can talk with somebody who understands them and also can share, because this is what I meant in the introduction, that I think beside all the evil things and all the business implications that they want to sell, I think they're also a little bit interested in how to get out of this and how what could be options to still make money, but do it in a little bit better way, so that all these institutions aren't constantly in their necks. So I think maybe there should be something like let's call it a Robert Koch Institute for Data and Algorithm, in a way that we can all like move into a kind of protected space where these companies are forced to share and to open, but on the other side, it's not, the results that what they open is not tomorrow at the other company, and not tomorrow, maybe right away in the newspaper, but we can develop some form of relationship and access for people who have the elevated knowledge. And at the same time, of course, not to forget the general public, but what I think also like the trick, I think it's a corporate trick now to talk about all these topics at the same time. And I think I also would say, I would also say that that the whole ethics debate often goes in a direction that basically deviates from the law discussion, because I think ethics is used by industry as a way to distract us because many of the things that we discuss we're also good people and we discuss ethics topics, they are important, but many of these topics would be covered already by law. So why do we need to discuss with Facebook what they should do and what they need to? I think we should try to separate some of these discussions and what's the interest of the public, what's the interest of and I think some of the interest of the public would be that some people, maybe not the public, sees much more than the public could ever see because of data protection or whatsoever. That's just the comment to add on Theresa's comments.
Thanks a lot, Jürgen. I think it's quite obvious, Wolfie, that I'm going to ask you to speak next. Where do you see the future for studying data flows, for example?
Yeah, so basically what I have to say is, from my point of view, today's like digital infrastructure, today's actually existing digital technology and infrastructure is totally broken based on all this venture capital model. In so many ways, it harms people in society, and it's absolutely not like what I would call like public interest digital infrastructure. But if we would have like something like a public interest digital infrastructure, then the question after public interest research would be a different one. So now, as we don't have public interest digital infrastructure, as I would say, the main role of it, from my point of view, is like holding the industry accountable and helping to enforce regulation, to think about how better regulation can be put in place, companies can be broken up and so on, which is also a huge challenge, because all the industry players are funding all kinds of institutions, from non-profits to research institutions and so on. There is a huge issue with revolving doors and so on. So there is and there is like a huge unbalance between the resources the industry has and the resources people have who are participating in looking at all this stuff from a public interest point of view. So this is for me the main issue, but of course, there are some more practical things. Yes, transparency. So transparency is very often, I think, misused by companies to to just perpetuate what they do and offer a transparency for some pseudo transparency. But of course, I think the huge tech giants, yeah, this is a precondition. They must become totally transparent. I even would say we need something like freedom of information requests for private corporations, not just for the government. And I would say like when we talk about utility scale services, then the role of trade secrets must be very limited. So this must completely change, but this alone, transparency alone won't fix everything, but I think it's a precondition that we understand. From my point of view, it's like about data processing, about data partnerships, about algorithms, but it's much more actually. And yeah, and in addition to this, I have some more notes. Yeah, I think we need more also like access to data for public interest research. But this is a very dangerous path also, I think, because currently when we talk about access to data for research purposes, it's very often not just for public interest purposes but also like for commercial purposes. And I don't want to have legislation that enables public interest research, but also helps Google to access all the health data from the whole European Union for some proclaimed commercial research purposes. So I think it's a fine line, and yeah, I have some more notes, but it's chaos. What I also would agree to is me having access to the Facebook data, yes. But I also would warn, just giving it to me, there must be very strict conditions and contractual and institutional checks and balances so that I don't sell it to Cambridge Analytica afterwards. And yes, I think in many ways, like transparency and access to data from those commercial companies for experts, for auditors, or for the Robert Koch Institute for transparency, data and algorithmic transparency, or how you call it. I think, yeah, I would welcome that. So far, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Wolfie. I would like to move on to you, Jonathan. You mentioned there are some challenges for doing critical data practices. Maybe you would like to elaborate that a little bit more.
Oh, wow, there's so much to say. I'm going to have to, just for a second, put on my science and technology studies scholar hat, because I think that there are many things that have been discussed which could benefit temporarily from that lens, playing the role as a researcher who doesn't just produce research, but also who studies how research is produced. There's so much we can learn. And I would say, this is also something that comes up in practice amongst, say, digital journalists and investigative communities. There is a need for all sorts of reasons, including legal reasons, the production of evidence, to account for what you have done. And producing accounts is not always straightforward or immediate, right? It depends on the context for which the account is being produced. We had a lovely chapter in the Data Journalism Handbook from someone at Global Witness looking at how, for example, data notebooks are used as a form of virtual witnessing for legal teams within the organization, for people who don't necessarily do the data work themselves. I guess here, I think the wonderful thing that we can do is to encourage a kind of culture of empiricism, by which I mean not just gathering and producing better factual representations, but also attending to and documenting and thinking about how knowledge is produced and how expertise is configured and the implications of that, including the political implications for how we think about what the world is and who does what to who, but these sorts of questions of power and intervention, just to check ourselves that we're not accidentally reinforcing ways of thinking about how things are organized, which could end up kind of limiting political ambition. Including around things like regulation versus questions of ownership. It's not just the case that we need to kind of tell big companies to introduce a measure, right? Like, shouldn't we also consider the possibility of breaking up large companies, thinking of completely different sorts of ownership arrangements, or also, not just assuming that actually the work required to maintain something like Facebook, for example, coincides with their description of how the company works, where it is, even with things like economic activity tax, right? Like, taxation is such an important part of this whole industry, right? And it's often something that is displaced when we talk about other sorts of interventions and mechanisms. And we need to be aware of that, because other people are certainly aware of this, and we would be foolish not to think of these things, which is to say there is a lot of what my colleague Norcha Maris calls aspirational ontology, which is to say ontologies which are produced aspirationally to kind of think about how the world is carved up in particular ways, which are suitable for particular kinds of projects, but which we shouldn't always necessarily import directly into our programs and agendas and how we do things. And that includes, what counts as an infrastructure, what counts as a platform, what counts as data, what counts as a user, and so on. And I guess one of the important things that I think we should come back to briefly is this notion of public interest, how this is defined, how it is done, the implications of very professionalized notions of what public interest is, which of course goes back, we can trace this historically to the professionalization of campaigning, the centralization of trade unions, the delegation of work in complex technological societies to certain kinds of interest groups. And I think this work, again, that sort of Norcha Maris and many others have done in STS, of empiricizing the question of publicity, what counts as a public, not just taking the public for granted, but looking at the emergence of publics in relation to issues and in relation to how people are affected by things, is also really important, which is a matter of kind of being alive to what is troubling for people, rather than just assuming that that can be straightforwardly delegated and represented, even though of course we need to make law and policy, but those are not the only things that need to happen. And I guess it's important in these sorts of collaborative projects that is remembered. Finally, I guess the staying with the question of how problems are composed, and I think there's a lot of kind of very reactive work that is going on in relation to things like content moderation, fact checking, misinformation. I think slowing down and paying attention to how information trouble is materialized, how it emerges, how it's understood is really important. We've written about this in relation to the work on fake news and misinformation, taking a lively approach to data and methods. And I think this again comes back to a point that Jürgen was making, in that we cannot take methods of the medium for granted. And we can also afford to be critical in thinking about their social lives, where they come from, their sponsors, their orientation, the forms of expertise, but also how they're not exhausted by these things and how we might use them differently for other forms of listening, including this wonderful phrase from Susan Lee Starr on the relationship between technology, everyday life, and silence. I love this phrase, to think about who and what is missing if we use data, methods, and infrastructures inventively to think about what we might be missing, including the broader planetary situation, data centers, biodiversity loss, wage stagnation, racial, gender, and economic inequalities. And this is something that's come up in the critical disinformation studies group in the US, who've said we need to look at broader contexts and histories of some of these information problems, which are often more narrowly defined. But I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Thanks for pointing to all those different issues and need to be addressed. And I would like to hand over to John and ask, where do you think next step should be for doing research and data with data donations?
Thank you, Meropi. If you don't mind, I think I'll just pivot here slightly, because I've been taking notes from what everybody's been saying, and I just want to weigh in. So Theresa and Jonathan and everyone really was talking about public interest and what do we mean by this. Like Theresa said, it's a newish term. And right now, this question is a matter of legal definition, at least in Europe. Where the Digital Services Act is being negotiated, and where there is a provision in the Act for data access for vetted researchers who do research in the public interest. Yeah, I would say that just looking at this provision, like Wolfie mentioned, there should be like freedom of information laws of platforms and companies, not just of governments. And so we have maybe some version of this. It's still in the proposal, would still be intermediated by national authorities, but this is the general idea, is that vetted researchers can apply to access platform data. But there are still open questions about this, which are currently being negotiated. And so this is the question of who gets to be a public interest researcher. There's sort of a disagreement about whether this should be limited to academics or people with academic affiliations, or if this definition should be broadened to include civil society organizations like ours, for example, or like many, like everybody here, or also journalists, for example. And
also, how can we make sure that we then actually have access, right? Because that's what we have also seen in the past. Then there is a lot of blah blah, and researchers get access, and then 2 years later we realize, oh, wait a second, this was not the whole access.
Exactly. So the matter of so also what kind of carve-outs and exceptions are there? So if platforms can say, oh, they're a trade, we have to protect our trade secrets, so we won't give over the data. I mean, this is also being negotiated, what the language of the law. But also this question of operationalizing data access, because just because it's there in the law doesn't mean that there's an infrastructure or like proper frameworks in place to make it possible in a real way. And so we published a report last year in our Governing Platforms project, which was about this question of operationalizing data access and kind of talking about what would this Robert Koch Institute for Data and Algorithms, what could this look like? How could this work to have like a layer as an intermediary between researchers and platforms that also has the authority to force platforms to hand over data, but also that the regulation is spelled out in a way that there are procedural safeguards that protect sensitive data. We published a case study. I'll share the link in the chat, as basically looking at FinData, which was a Finnish legal initiative, which was about enabling research access to health data in a way that protects sensitive data. And we think that this is a perfectly good model. And then to just go back to the future for data donation projects, I mean, this isn't something that is being discussed in the Digital Services Act. I mean, this is this question of is there sort of like a something like a safe harbor in the terms of conditions. This is, I think, the term safe harbor is the term being used in the US to protect organizations who are doing public interest research, essentially, like in the terms and conditions of platforms. But this is something we don't have yet. But the fact remains that we still, even if this DSA regulation goes great and we can build up this capacity, it's going to take years for this to really work. And meanwhile, data donation projects we have done, can do, are doing, and we can still have important insights from them. So yeah, that's what I'll say. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, John. I would like to open the floor now to the audience and allow everyone to ask questions. Katja did kindly post that everyone has the possibility to write the question in the chat, and we already have a couple of questions. But Theresa, would you like to follow up on John's statement?
Yeah, just something super small, because maybe I can correct a misunderstanding, because I didn't mean that the term or the idea of the public interest is new. It's actually a super old idea. Just to the discourse of AI, it's kind of newish. But for instance, in the GDPR, 70 times the public interest is used. And actually also there's a lot of history how the law defines the public interest in practice. So actually our societies do have quite some record of defining this in practice. That's also why I think it's a much stronger, more political term than talking about ethics. And there I really agree to what has been said before, that I just wanted to kind of throw that in.
Yeah, and I appreciate that correction, because I did misspeak. It's this question of who's a vetted researcher, who's allowed to engage in public interest research. That's what's being debated. Thank you for that.
Thanks to both of you. Actually, the first question is by Simran. Simran, would you like to ask your question yourself? Or should I read it out?
Yeah, you could go ahead and read it, because I have bad bandwidth here in India. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks a lot for your question. So it is a question for John. What are the existing anti-SLAPP protections in the US or elsewhere for lawsuits brought to organizations or public interest research interventions?
That was a question for me. I don't know if I can answer it. I've been only thinking about the EU lately, and I know anti-SLAPP laws in the US. I wish I had the answer there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Is anyone else from our panel? Does anyone else want to answer? It's a tricky one, right?
I will post a link to that. I'm currently searching for something, and I will post it to the chat in a bit.
Thanks a lot, Katja. Fantastic. Our second question is by Caroline. Would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Katja and Maya, already for your answer. I should look into this conference. I will. Well, like my colleagues and I at AIT, the Austrian Institute of Technology, are working on the question right now, how regulations and ethics guidelines impact the work of software engineers and their day-to-day software development practice when they are developing public interest AI or other applications. And so I wanted to ask you, what are your experiences on this? And do you have any interesting sources on this topic that would really be of great help?
Who would like to give an
I mean,
answer?
I can answer something more broader. That is because I'm a computer scientist by myself, and I spent quite some time also at universities with computer scientists and software developers. And I mean, how can we engage them in public interest research? I think in the first step, we need to find a way to put into the curricula of computer scientists that there are humans who use the machines. And I think that would be a good first step. So, I mean, at TUM in Munich, we talk about human-centered engineering, but we, of course, have still no idea how to do it. But I think, and I teach every semester a class in the computer science department called computational social science. And it is quite fascinating to see basically that computer scientists, after studying like 4 years computer science, have never thought a single second about like the people of the games that they implement, or the people of the systems that they implement, and also that maybe some things that you implement because you do it, because everybody knows how people work. Yes, everybody has social psychology knowledge from the newspaper, and so you implement some things in an algorithm and you don't even think about it. You create bias with the algorithm. So this is maybe a way too broad answer, but I think there's a long way of going in this whole interaction between actually to picking them up, and also maybe from an educational perspective, how can we, or I don't know, maybe interventions as well, and in a sense of how to connect these worlds with each other. And yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's a lot of awareness on all sides of things. But maybe Theresa has a more concrete answer.
Theresa, please.
Yeah, maybe like from all the research that I know about this question, like how much are engineers actually using ethical guidelines that exist right now? I don't remember the exact names, but it's astonishing low how much they are used. And also, I know people who actually developed guidelines, and when I asked them, so yeah, what do you know about how your guideline is actually used? They said, like, we have no idea, and we know of no case where it is actually used. But they spend a lot of time developing that guideline, which is in itself quite interesting. But actually, to your point, we are conducting a survey during this next month where we will ask that question to projects in the field of public interest AI. So we will also publish the data that we will gather in that survey. So at least so somewhere in the next, I don't know, half year, somewhere around there should be an answer for at least some scope of projects to what they actually use and if it is used at all. Yeah, that's my answer.
Thanks a lot, Theresa. We have another question by Elke. Would you like to ask it yourself?
Sure, thank you. So I would have a question concerning something that I've read and heard very often, namely that business lobbies and in particular SMEs within the EU often claim that too much regulation would hamper innovation. And so they couldn't develop properly, and so they couldn't create a counterbalance to US digital giants. And in an interview, I was now told that African SMEs say exactly the same when EU or policy experts try to give advice on digital regulation to African governments. They would really be interested in you elaborating on that, because I suppose it's not a question of black and white, and also of how regulation is implemented. And I would be interested also in how a balance between regulation and the protection of citizens and their data, and the possibility of companies to develop, how this balance can be created. Thank you.
Wolfie, would you like to try and answer?
Yes, so I would say, and the first, this is not our main topic actually now, like whether regulation can impose like small and medium enterprises and so on. But I want to try a quick answer. The first thing is for me, like, of course, you can argue regulation. If there is regulation, then a large enterprise has always is easier to comply with it because they have a huge compliance department. So you could argue we cannot have any regulation of anything because always the large company will have a benefit. This cannot be the solution. So and the second thing is that Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and many others, they have really many organizations, they fund many organizations who all the time claim that poor small businesses will be so harmed when Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and so on are regulated. So this is like a huge lobbying stuff. So I would say you can look at all this stuff in detail for each regulation and so on. The important thing is that regulation against the large platforms must be enforced. This doesn't happen. The Irish Data Protection Authority isn't doing anything. This is a huge problem and not the regulation itself. And we also need like antitrust cases that really work and so on. And I think, yeah, so far.
Thanks, Wolfie. Let's move. Okay, Jürgen. Yes, please. Would you like to follow up? You're still muted, so.
Yeah, I want to follow up, but also include a couple of comments here, because I think we can summarize a couple of these topics with, I mean, it's it's a lot about the incentive structure, right? So like, what's the, like, every time somebody tells me about it's so impossible for Facebook to remove, I don't know, racist content. I mean, have you ever tried to watch the goals of a soccer game that happened last night? It's not possible because YouTube blocks these videos within seconds. Why? Because there's a huge interest, there's a huge industry interest of these public, of these private companies who want to sell you to watch the goals of the last soccer game. So so what's the incentive structure for the companies to do it? And I think from the public interest perspective, and I think Europe is in a good way, it is the law. At the end of the day, I think European laws are the number one argument to improve the the incentive structure from a public perspective. And I mean, when you remember when this funny Mark Zuckerberg was in front of the US Senate about his issue with the 2018, I think, Senate elections or midterm elections, where they had the issues with the Russian paid ads and these kind of things. And then he was in front of the Senate, and I don't know, next day he announced that Facebook now has a department with 1,000 people checking on these ads because he was in trouble. And so I think the learning for Europe is we need to continue bringing these companies in trouble, and then they will comply because they will find a way to still make money even if they comply. So I think the pressure needs to be on, and at the end of the day, there is a chance that situations improves step by step, and they still make a lot of money. And because they don't care at the end of the day, I mean, they will find a way out and they will optimize it. And one more sentence to the incentive structure, I think, which is important from my university perspective. I see little incentive structure for researchers to actually go in this area. And this is another problem because, I mean, I see a lot of NGOs and people doing things. But when I look at academia, I mean, the incentive structure here is to optimize algorithms for the companies. And you can get good jobs at the best universities in the world by improving the suggestion algorithms for link optimization and all these things I call. At the end of the day, basically just optimize the Facebook suggestion algorithm. And I think there's also we need to think about how can we make the city of Vienna I don't know, spend 10 million euros on research projects in this public interest area, and not just leave this out to random things. And one last comment, because in the US I've seen this many times, that where here the public interest is defined as like Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense spends billions of dollars in research institutions on funding. So like and the money, I mean, the research follows the money. So we have there thousands and thousands of young researchers doing exactly this because there is the money. So I think this is another aspect. We need to create some incentive structure for people to actually follow these and do this research and have positions, have career opportunities, and have money in the institutions, and not just in fragile NGOs that where people kill themselves for trying to fix these problems that actually are the problems of society. So government also needs to pay for this stuff, and not just and everybody's happy when we have Schrems 1, 2, 3 or whatever, or when AlgorithmWatch does some crazy things. But the actual question is, why don't you pay for this?
Thanks, Jürgen. Actually, time flies by. I'm not sure who was first, Jonathan or Theresa, who'd like to comment shortly. You're still muted, Theresa.
Yeah, I can just be super quick, because I totally second what has just been said. Like, there needs to be an ecosystem for public interest research and public interest tech development. But also I wanted to add one thing, and that is, besides the regulation, also there needs to be governmental institutions that actually have the capacity to do the regulation. So data scientists as part of the public infrastructure administration. And of course, there needs to be public interest research in NGOs, and there should be more of that. But right now, it's always the David fighting the Goliath. And first of all, there should be a state Goliath fighting the industry Goliath. And besides that, a lot of other projects. But yeah, I think there is this disbalance that small NGOs can't really address. And so, yeah, I think that's a big issue, that our states need to build the capacities to actually get teeth to then also follow the regulations that they have in mind.
Thanks, Theresa. Jonathan, please.
I'll just be very quick. And hey, Theresa, we're going to say many similar things. I was also going to mention the importance of having a kind of tactical ecology and the risks of having well, I guess what you could consider more of a tactical monoculture, as in if you're just like, if thinking in terms of layering different actors together and sorts of aggregate effects rather than just hoping that we can kind of somehow templatize progress. And that's not least because I'm going to quote, I guess some of you may have seen the sitcom Succession, where the sort of mean boss Logan Roy says, "Nothing is a line. Everything everywhere is always moving. Forever. Get used to it." And that's kind of from the corporation. And I guess that, you know, I think learning how to be alive to how these different sorts of spaces change and the unexpected consequences of regulation in different areas, which is not to say not to regulate, but just to be alive to what regulation produces. And there's wonderful work in STS on this. And again, like, for example, Sheila Jasnov, The Ethics of Invention, has a really nice section at the end looking at different sorts of things that have been tried, which are maybe underrepresented now in terms of how participation is organized and so on, and different sorts of governance and policy mechanisms in different countries around the world. But I guess going back to sort of a comment earlier, taking a more holistic approach to platform problems and not just kind of sealing them off from other societal issues, because I think, you know, broadening and diversifying participation around policymaking is also not unrelated to the state of labor and civil society capacity is, you know, also affected by the decline of unions and the kind of increase of working hours and the reduction of free time. You know, there's all sorts of things going on which have a really significant effect on what it means to have more participatory policy in some of these areas. And I think we would be rewarded by kind of remembering and looking at that.